Hi, this is Priyanka and I welcome you all to Srijan Wednesday webinars. For those who are attending for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies. As a part of this initiative, we host webinars every alternate Wednesday. We have speakers from different domains who talk about subjects like front-end technologies, UI/UX, mobile apps, media, entrepreneurship, digital marketing, and many more. Our today's webinar is focused on developing large-scale applications in AngularJS. So in the first 40 minutes, our speaker will talk about how you can actually structure large AngularJS projects and how to optimize these applications for better performance. The last 15 minutes will be for a Q&A round. So I request you all to please type in any questions that you have during the presentation and we will take them up towards the end of the session. I would now like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. We have with us Shyam Seshadri. Shyam is the founder and CEO of Fundu Solutions, an innovative web solutions company focused on building products and solutions using cutting-edge technologies. I welcome you, Shyam. So without taking up any more time, let's get started. Shyam, over to you.
Thank you, Priyanka. Hi, my name is Shyam Seshadri, and I'm here today to talk to you about developing large-scale applications in AngularJS. And yes, it is possible. So there is a certain notion around sometimes that Angular is just for toy applications, or it's not really a great framework. That has been changing in the past few months. And we'll see today how you can use AngularJS to develop really large-scale, performant, fast, snappy web applications. A quick introduction about me. So, as Priyanka mentioned, I am the CEO and founder of Fundu Solutions. We develop web applications and mobile apps using the latest and greatest of technologies. Used to work at Google as a software engineer and was part of the original AngularJS team there. I've also written 2 books about AngularJS for O'Reilly Media. At Fundu, we do both Angular as well as Node.js consulting, both in terms of architecture level decisions and hands-on development and workshops. We develop both mobile and web products and evangelize all the latest and greatest technologies in India. What are we talking about today? So I want to spend the first few minutes briefly talking about some of the greatest features of Angular, the difference between a small and a large application in the context of AngularJS, and then we'll get on into how to structure large AngularJS projects for rapid development and talk about how and what some of the most common bottlenecks there are in web applications and how to speed them up. So before we start, I would like to ask or start with a quick poll to get a sense of your experience with AngularJS. Priyanka? Ten more seconds to go before the poll ends. All right. Okay, so let's get started. Thank you for attending to the poll. So quickly, very quickly, let's talk about some of the great things that AngularJS provides. So AngularJS is an MVC framework, and it's centered around the concept of having the framework do your grunt boilerplate work while you get to focus on the more interesting, more specific aspects of your application. One of the main features which promotes that is data binding, which allows you to get rid of the boilerplate code that you would write to funnel your data from your server to the UI and the data back from the UI to the server. This is accomplished through bindings, data binding and modeling, so ngbind, ngmodel, and reduces this boilerplate code that is really not specific to your application. The second important thing is that it leverages and extends HTML for templating. So rather than learning a whole new templating language or XML as some frameworks do, you end up using normal HTML in your AngularJS applications. Styling, still using CSS, no new language there. But what it does is it extends HTML by introducing the concept of directives. The HTML standards have not really changed in the last decade or more. You still have inputs, divs, spans. But the latest and greatest web applications have charts, sliders, tabs, accordion, which HTML still doesn't have inbuilt. And that's where directives step in to fill that gap by extending the HTML language. Angular is an MVC framework, so you get to separate your concerns, your model, the data that drives your application is separated from the view, the rendering logic, and the controller, which is the business logic of how data is fetched, what part of the data to show to the user, how to respond to user interactions. All of that is encapsulated in controllers. The next great thing, and that's one of the core philosophies around Angular, is the ease of testing. The Angular developers really believed that testing helped clean up your code, make it more stable, more structured. And so each and every part of Angular is easy to unit test, easy to integration test. And so we built Karma to make testing really fast. Jasmine and dependency injection allows you to easily test each and every part of your code. The protractor testing framework allows you to write end-to-end tests that behave just like a real user would. But the greatest thing about Angular is the great and brilliant community that has formed around it. From Google Plus to Twitter to Stack Overflow to Quora, there is a great AngularJS community of developers who are using this, who are propagating all the great things that they are working on, and that makes working in Angular a charm. It's brilliant. That said, Angular is very easy to start off with. Data binding, controllers are all very simple, quick to create, and before you know it, within a day or two, you can have a very simple, tiny application up and about. A small application is tiny, fast, it's very easy to develop. And structure is not something you would think about at that point. But as your application grows, it can really quickly become an unmanageable mess. Without the proper structure, without the proper build guidelines, it becomes really hard to keep rapidly developing new features on an existing application. Testing becomes a much more challenging aspect. Performance you're never sure about until you encounter some performance problems. So today's talk is structured around how do we tackle these large applications. Can we set up ourselves for success so that it's not something we deal with when we get to it, but rather structure it around getting around it and structuring it in such a way that your application is a dream to develop, whether it is small or large. The size of the application should not make a difference. So the very first thing we'll talk about is the project structure itself. How do you structure your folders, your files, and keep them in such a way that promotes easy development, a structured approach across your team so that any new developer coming to your team still has a guideline of sorts of where does what go, so that he doesn't have to learn a whole new set of structure every time he jumps between projects. And the way to think about your large AngularJS projects is to follow a very modular approach. By that, I mean that the aim should be to structure your application along independent reusable modules. You want to think in terms of functionality, in terms of modules, rather than types. If you go about the internet, you will see a lot of sample applications which say, put all your controllers together in one folder, put all your services in another folder, directives in another, filters in another, and so on. This kind of structure, this kind of project structure really does not scale very well. And what we've come up with instead of best practices is a way to split your application into what we call components and sections. And the other recommendation is to have your test code right beside the code, so that you're not left trying to find and dig through your project to find unit tests. They're right beside the file, the lines of code that they are testing. Now, when we say components, we're talking about reusable components that are not specific to a project or to a view. These could be things like your authorization service, could be things like chart widgets, these are things that you want to be able to pick as a complete AngularJS module and plunk it in any other project and be able to use it right off the bat. Sections, on the other hand, are more directly linked to a view. They represent your UI hierarchy, the templates that the user sees, the controllers that control them. These go into sections, and these are generally specific to a certain project. A sample application structure, as I mentioned, your components, you could have an auth component, which has an authorization service, along with the test for it, which is auth.service_spec.js. You could have a UI component, which could be further broken down into subcomponents like file upload, charts, sliders. Each of these component folders could be a module by itself or comprised of submodules. So UI might be an AngularJS module, and file upload itself could be another AngularJS module. To use these modules in a separate project, all I need to do is pick up this set of JavaScript along with the module definition and move it to another project. So it gives us instant reusability. You're ensuring that all related code, all related functionality are grouped together, rather than all the services, all the directives, and so on. Directives in the components could have their template HTML, could have their CSS along with it, so that when it's picked up, it's a complete package and not just bits and pieces. Sections, on the other hand, could be your home screen, a list screen. The home screen could further be broken down into a left nav, a main section, and so on. And these would reflect your application hierarchy. So things like Angular routes or UI router states and substates would be folders and subfolders inside the sections. You would then have an app.js at the highest folder level, which brings up together your entire application module, and this common CSS and the index.html that needs to get served. The advantage of this sort of structure is you could think about a different app for desktop websites versus a different app for mobile. Both of these could just pick different modules where your desktop web app might be the entire application. Your mobile AngularJS application just consists of certain views and certain sections instead of the entire thing. So it gives you configurability in how you wire your application together. Next, this gives us a structure to start writing our applications, but let's talk about what creates slow web applications. And these are some of the most common reasons that we've seen across projects that cause slowness, whether it be the slow loading or the slow rendering. The most common reason for the initial perceived slowness is loading lots of script tags and CSS in the head tag. The reason why this is not recommended are script tags are what we call blocking tags, which means while the script loads, no other activity happens. So if the script tag is in the head, the rest of the HTML does not load until that entire script has loaded. Whereas ideally, you at least want to let the user know of some activity, have some HTML rendered to the user to tell him something is happening so that he's not stuck staring at a blank screen. Further reasons are slow subsequent loads, whether you're loading too much, the network activity is slow, and part of that comes down to the third reason, where once you load a lot of data, you end up trying to re-render your entire HTML. Whether it's non-performant HTML or because you're trying to display too much at one go. CSS also can lead to very slow web applications. Linear gradients are some of the worst examples of what can cause rendering slowness. And coming to an Angular specific reason, having too many watchers and too many scopes in your application can cause churn, while Angular tries to figure out what has changed and what it needs to update. Too many watchers. The rule of thumb last time I heard was around 2,000 to 3,000 bindings in a page. More than that can cause slowness. So the easy stuff, like I like to call it, is the simple stuff we can do to immediately see a major improvement in the speed, snappiness, rendering of our web application. The very first thing is the order of the load. Load the CSS in the head so that the user sees a nicely rendered page, but defer the loading of the JavaScript to the end of the body tag, so that the HTML, some basic static HTML, is up there in front of the user while your Ajax application kicks in and does further activity. And that's the simple stuff. Some other simple stuff which are usually just flags to toggle are things like ensure that you're not loading too many files as part of your index.html. The browser generally has a limit on the number of parallel requests it can make to the same domain. Ensuring that you concatenate all your JavaScript into a single file, all your CSS into a single file, and serving it can significantly increase the speed of your initial load. Gzipping, which is usually a simple flag on most front-end servers, is again a very simple benefit to get about a 50% reduction in the network traffic. Minification, which is going through your JavaScript and CSS to remove spaces, rename variables, to again reduce the payload over the wire, is again a very simple thing to do. Further optimizations along network usage could be to ensure you're not doing too many parallel requests. Some browsers stop requests to the same domain if there are more than 6 or 8. So trying to ensure you're not loading more than 6 or 8 requests at the same time could be a step towards speeding up. Lazy load using require.js or some other technique to ensure that if you have a very large application, you're only loading certain modules, certain pages and the related code once the user gets to it, rather than loading upfront. And then we come to the DOM, where some of it is more of a UX decision. Does the user really want to see 10,000 list items, or does he want to see 5 or 10? Do you want pagination, lazy loading, infinite scroll? These are kinds of UI decisions which can help you reduce the amount of DOM elements that the page has to render at any given point. Being selective about what your watchers are, what your functions and bindings are doing is again another step towards speeding things up. Keeping an eye or thinking about these as you develop your application ensures that you don't spend time, waste time on the easy stuff later to speed up your application, and you then focus on the more nitty-gritty actual details of performance improvements. So I'd like to quickly now jump into a specific case study of an implementation we had to do for a client. We had to implement an electronic program guide where we were trying to display a program grid with about 500 channels that the user should be able to see across 14 days of time in half-an-hour slots. You do quick multiplication, you're talking about tens of thousands of DOM elements if each program in each channel gets a DOM. In addition to this, some of the requirements were that the user should be able to smoothly scroll across, pan, zoom across the program guide and see the channels and programs. There should not be too many loading indicators or stops where the user has to stop for a second while the data loads. And each program, these 500 channels, 14 days, half-an-hour slot programs, could have different states. Some of them might be expired, some of them might be recording, and so on and so forth. And all of this had to work as required on IE8 as well. Now, whoever here has dealt with IE8 knows that it's not an easy task. So what did we do? So the very first attempt at the EPG was saying, look, let's keep things as simple as possible. Let's use ng repeats for each of the channel and ng repeat within each channel for each of the programs. And we would use ng class and ng bind to get the data from our controller into the UI. And again, initially, let's load all the data. How bad could it be? It might be half a meg to a meg over the wire. How bad could it be? So let me quickly jump to a plunker to see how that works. So this plunker that I have here simulates that. You have a controller which just creates a whole set of arrays for the data backing this grid and some functions for styling this grid. And I have a simple directive which allows me to time how long this entire rendering process takes. So if I refresh this and check, between creating this array and rendering it, depending on the network speed, takes up to as much as 3.5 seconds. This involves both. This is after the array has been created and before the DOM elements are put into the UI and rendered. Here we're talking about 100 cross 100, so only 10,000 items. If I clicked update to say simulate the polling where we fetch new data from the server and have to update the UI, you're looking at an additional 3 seconds, which for any application is never a great experience. You're talking about 2 seconds, 1.5 seconds for the initial fetch of the data, and a further 2 to 3 seconds to render this grid, which is just a whole bunch of data elements. This was of course dead on arrival, not a possible solution. And when we analyzed this, these were the bottlenecks that we found. The initial data load over the wire of fetching these 10,000, 15,000 items, obviously not great. Even gzipped doesn't help. The ng repeats and the ng repeats within these ng repeats were definitely not optimal for large data sets. Each ng repeat creates a scope of its own, and then you have an exponential growth when you do x cross y. And having a binding for each one of these scopes quickly adds up. And then for each of these, there is a DOM element that needs to be created, re-rendered with the right class. Each individual manipulation might take on the order of 5 to 10 milliseconds, but across thousands and thousands of items, those quickly add up into valuable seconds. And so the number of watches, even though each watcher might be a millisecond, when you run it across 10,000 items, can start taking as much as half a second, which really is not good. So what did we do? So the first question we had when we saw this, when we started timing and analyzing this, is ng repeat really the problem here? Or is it the giant size of the data that the problem is from? So we said, look, what if we completely dropped ng repeats and used jQuery and manual HTML manipulation in creation to take the data from our JSON into the UI? Would that help? So if you look at this plunker, the controller remains pretty much the same, still creating the same amount of items. But this time, instead of having an ng repeat within an ng repeat, we end up with just a simple directive which says here's a grid that you need to drop and these are the items for the grid. And what the directive does is something very, very simple and straightforward. It says, let me manually create this HTML that you need. No data binding, no binders, no scopes, no watches. Just take this entire HTML string and put it out there into the UI. And when we run this, you will see that the time to render this data is on the order of 100 to 150 milliseconds rather than the 3 odd seconds that we were seeing. So clearly, while DOM and the number of DOM elements is an issue, that is not the only bottleneck. So how can we tackle this? So some very simple techniques to use when you're tackling large data sets. The ng repeat directive gives us a track by syntax. What this allows us to do is give a hint to AngularJS to say this is how you identify whether you have previously allocated a DOM element to this element, to this item in your array, or whether it is a new one. So you could look at saying something like call in row track by call.id. This way, even if the array gets a new array from the server, Angular looks at the ID field of the column to say, look, I have already created an element for this. Let me just update the data in it rather than creating a new DOM element. DOM is usually the biggest bottleneck in any application, not just AngularJS. And so using the track by, you can start reducing the number of new DOM elements that Angular creates and updates. The second thing to think about is how often is the data that you're rendering going to change? If the answer is not too often or not at all, use the bind once syntax. Bind once, when you add an ng bind, Angular updates the data in the UI and adds a watch on it to say anytime if the data changes, update the UI again. This is great and reduces the amount of code we have to write, but it is not required for a large amount of data. Think menu items. Think this kind of grid where once the data is out there, it's there. The data itself does not change unless the user interacts. So there is a bind once integrated into AngularJS 1.3, and if you're using 1.2 or before, there is a third-party bind once directive that you can use to optimize and reduce the number of scopes and watchers in your application. The third thing you can do is reduce the number of DOM elements in the UI. ng-show and ng-hide are great directives to selectively hide and show different elements on the page. But all they do is just set CSS so that the DOM elements gets displayed none. The DOM element itself still exists in the DOM structure. The ng-if directive ensures that the DOM element is removed in case a condition is not met. So that's a small, quick change you can do to reduce the heaviness of your DOM. And the last one you can do is be selective on the amount of watchers and bind expressions that you have. Instead of binding to a function which does a calculation every time, bind to a variable which is the calculated value. Think about if you need 3 watchers, or if you can get away with 1 inside your application. These kind of simple thoughts can again give you a quick improvement in the performance of your application. So what did we do for the grid? We analyzed it and we figured out a few things. The data, as I had mentioned before, was more of a fetch and display. After the data was there in the UI, it was unlikely to change. So we created a custom directive, which instead of using ng-bind and ng-repeat, it was even before the times of bind once, so we created the directive which displayed the data and did not add the watcher. This gave us a significant performance improvement. We also tackled the case of lazy loading. In case of the UI, the user was only seeing about 10 to 15 channels across 3 hours of data. So instead of loading everything at once, we loaded only what the user saw and loaded the rest of the data as and when the user started navigating. And there, to ensure that the user did not get stuck seeing loading indicators, we started priming the cache, preloading views based on where the user is and what he's currently seeing. So we adopted a strategy where the user had a view, we loaded that view along with the 4 potential next views that the user could navigate to. Based on that, we then preloaded other data so that by the time the user starts or navigates to the potential next view, we fetch the next ones and the next ones. So this way, everything other than these were placeholders in the UI. There were no data, it was not fetched, and there was one giant DOM element instead of 500 or 5,000 as initially the case was. Between these, we figured that we were able to load our entire program guide within a second, as opposed to an 8 or 9 second load on IE8 previously, and have the user navigate to different pages and different time slots without even seeing loading indicators. So these kind of complicated model structures are completely possible depending on your need. So to quickly summarize, things to keep in mind when you're developing your AngularJS or any web application, some of them are common, are to think about your build and deploy phase upfront. How do you glob, concatenate, serve your CSS and JavaScript files? How do you minify them? Do you need lazy loading, and if so, how are you going to accomplish that? Having that proper structure and build process upfront rather than trying to build it later is a huge improvement. Yeoman is a great workflow management tool which allows us to quickly create these sort of structures on demand. There is an AngularJS full stack generator which gives you a lot of these out of the box. Thinking about your network, how many network requests is your HTML making? Is your JavaScript making? Thinking about that and trying to avoid too many parallel requests. Ensuring that your caching strategy, browser level or your client level caching. Enabling gzip. And then thinking about your cache priming strategies. Can you preload views and sections of the UI that the user is going to see before he even navigates there to improve the perceived performance? And then finally, trying to think about the DOM. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of this is centered around your UX. How should the user see? What should he be seeing? Can you reduce the DOM elements that you need to display to the user? Thinking and being careful about how many watches you add, whether the bindings are expensive, can you pre-calculate? And data binding, using bind once from Angular version 1.3 or from the third-party directive whenever possible to reduce the amount of work Angular does each time it needs to update the UI. So thinking about these or having some sort of structure for all of these in mind when you approach your applications is extremely crucial and can save you hours and days of productivity as your application grows. So at this point, I'd like to thank you all for attending this, and I would like to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Shyam. That was a great session. And thank you everyone for listening out so patiently. Shyam, thank you again for sharing these interesting insights on AngularJS and what it can really do. And I hope that now a lot of developers will try out AngularJS for their larger projects as well. Moving on, I'm sure you guys have a couple of questions. Please press the raise hand button on your control panel if you want to ask your question using your microphone, or you can type your questions in the chat box below. So we have received our first question, Shyam. Peter wants to know that I have a lot of data in my DOM that the end user is supposed to be able to edit. I would like to use bind once to reduce the number of watchers. Is it possible to rebind some elements on demand to make it possible for the user to edit it?
Great question. So the bind once that is inbuilt in Angular or the third-party directive do not support the concept of selective updation. There is another bind once directive that is open source that is available online, which has the concept of notifying the updater to say now go update. So if you use that particular directive, and I don't remember it offhand, but that allows you to handle the case where the data might get updated at selective instances. Another option might be to have your own version of bind once. Bind once is a very simple directive to write, and you can leverage that and create your own version which has this capability. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Shyam. Peter, I hope that answers your question. If you have a follow-up question, please feel free to type in. So I'm going to take my next question here. Tenjin wants to ask, can I have the link to check your presentation later on? Tenjin, yes, we'll be sending you the presentation and recording after the webinar in a subsequent mail. Another question by Jindrix. He wants to know, can I use some ng expression in HTML code which is generated by your grid directive? Are there some best practices to create DOM elements with ng expressions without ng repeat?
Okay, so to answer that, Angular goes through two phases when you think about directives. The first one is called compile, which basically goes through the HTML looking for Angular directives. And in the directive there is also a link phase where at that point the bindings and specific functionality to your instance exist. So if you're generating Angular expressions, Angular directives on the fly dynamically, you want to ensure that they happen either in the compile phase of a directive, or there is an AngularJS service called $compile, without which Angular will not recognize these new directives that you are adding to the DOM. So you need to ensure that it happens either through the compile step, or you churn your HTML through the $compile service. Hope that helps.
Right, thank you so much. So Pankaj has a question. He wants to know Angular versus Knockout. Do you have any thoughts on that? And he has a second question that I will take up after you answer this one.
Okay. So both Angular and Knockout are great MVC frameworks, and at the end of the day you can accomplish pretty much the exact same thing with Angular or with Knockout. Where the difference comes is in the philosophy, where Knockout believes in unobtrusive HTML, where the HTML is as it is, pristine, no extra stuff. Data binding is achieved through JavaScript. And second, on top of that, Knockout at its core is purely a data binding framework. The additional things like routing and testing are separate add-ons that you have to find and add. That said, it's the only MVC framework that really supports IE6 still. AngularJS, on the other hand, is more of a complete MVC framework with routing, testing, and data binding. And it differs in the philosophy that the HTML should be declarative. So instead of some magic JavaScript which suddenly adds content or behavior to a HTML element, in Angular you would do it right at the element level itself by saying ng model or ng bind. So that's where the difference comes in. So it's more of a complete framework with a declarative approach versus a data binding framework with an unobtrusive philosophy. That's my 2 cents on Angular versus Knockout.
All right, thank you so much. His follow-up question was, do you have any thoughts on any other SPA framework when, I think it was more of a continuation when he was asking that. Yeah, so can you please share your thoughts on that as well?
Sure. So in terms of SPA frameworks, in terms of adoption and community, I do see Backbone and Angular being some of the top ones, along with Ember. Now, in the new exciting environment, though, what I do have my eyes on is one, React.js, which is going down the lines of isomorphic JavaScript, where it's very, very fast and it's focused on the whole concept of immutable datasets. And the other is around Meteor and Derby, where the focus is around writing your application in JavaScript and having everything be synchronous, concurrent. Too many frameworks out there to keep on top of everything, but these are the few frameworks or structures that I have my eye on. That's it.
Right. Thank you so much. Pankaj, if you have a follow-up question, please type in. We are going to take another question here. Abhijit wants to know, what are the key best practices for test-driven development for Angular-based projects?
Ah, great question. So Angular was started around the whole concept of TDD. All us developers who were working on Angular initially were all TDD proponents, which is why you see this whole focus on dependency injection, tests, and continuous integration in Karma and Jasmine. Best practices, I would say, follow the tenets of TDD. Write your tests first. Don't write any code until you've written a failing test for it. And write just enough code to make sure that test passes. Don't go about creating or over-engineering your solutions until there is a need for it. In terms of my workflow, I heavily use WebStorm, which has a great plugin for Karma inside of it. So I can have my tests running automatically as every time the file gets saved and see the results without having to press a button. So that kind of environment really helps in TDDs, where as I continue typing, my tests start telling me is it passing or failing. And if it's failing, I can either write the code to make it pass or hit undo to make it pass and fix my mistakes. I hope that helps.
Right. Thank you so much. So Claudius has actually raised her hand, so I believe she wants to ask a question. I'm going to put her on unmute so she can ask her question directly.
Okay.
Claudius, you're on unmute now.
Oh,
Hi, Claudius, can you please ask your question? I believe she's having some trouble. So Claudius, please type in your question, whatever it is, and we'll take it up. In the meanwhile, we'll take another question here. Mukesh wants to know that you spoke about in the beginning you said that folder structure isn't a good practice to keep directive, views, controller, filter in a different folder. I'm not very sure if it makes a lot of sense, but I believe he's seeking a little more clarification on that point.
Okay, let me just open up the folder structure part. So folder structure wise, what I was talking about was this concept of a components folder which houses your reusable services that are not specific to your application, your directives which you can again reuse, and filters. Again, the common theme around the components are they are not directly linked to a certain view or UI in your application. These are business logic or components that can be part of this project or any other if the need is there. And then you have sections, which is where the HTML and the controllers that are directly linked to a view. These would be reflective of your AngularJS routes or your AngularJS states, and each state might be represented by one HTML and one controller or possibly more. So the sections and the folders and subfolders inside of sections are your UI specific controllers and HTML, and the components are your services, directives, and filters, structured and folded under the correct functionality rather than by the type of the file. So you would not have controllers folder or services folder, but rather an authentication folder, a UI folder which might have a charts folder. You're thinking in terms of functionality. I hope that helps clarify things.
Right, thank you so much. So we have another question by John. He says, I've always had a simple question on MVCs. Whose role is it to save the data? Does MVCs cover that?
Good question. So MVC is more of a generic high-level idea that you want to separate out the model or the data from the view that the user sees and the controller, the business logic. Now in Angular, the C is actually split again between the controller, which is the AngularJS controller, not the controller concept, but the AngularJS controller which is directly linked to a view, and services which house common shared business logic. So in a lot of cases, the controller is going to say, I need to save this state. And the service is going to be the one that actually makes the server call to do that, or how's the business logic. But the controller is the trigger to say, go do this. Now, there is of course a whole level of discussion around whether the model should be aware of how to save itself and create itself versus the controller, the model being pure JSON or pure data. And that's a much more of a philosophy question than whether it's done by the controller or the view. So I'll leave that one out for later. I hope that helps.
Right. Thank you so much, Shyam, once again. So our next question is by Dani. He wants to know, what is your experience with R.js plus Angular.js for very large applications that need to be lazy loaded?
Great question, and at this point I wish I had an answer. I still haven't had the chance to integrate R.js as well as AngularJS in a large project. I still have a few toy projects and it's promising, but I wouldn't be comfortable recommending it yet on a large project. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you right now.
That's all right. So maybe we can take it up, maybe he can tweet you and we can take it up later. Claudius has typed in her question.
Definitely.
She would like to know, how well does AngularJS implement with Ruby on Rails?
Okay, so Angular is really server agnostic in that all it expects, and technically it doesn't even need a server, but really all you need is some way to communicate from your client to the server. Now, if that communication is over JSON, if your server exposes JSON endpoints, then nothing like it. You have no problems, it will easily integrate. But even if your server exposes, say, XML endpoints or some other crazy endpoints, not necessarily JSON, Angular has this concept of transformers which allow you to take the data that the server responds with and convert it into JSON in a common paradigm. So I've seen some very simple, great implementations with Ruby on Rails along with Node and all other technologies. It's really agnostic. As long as you structure your server side to give you server endpoints, especially talking in JSON, it can make your life very simple.
All right. So another question. What is the difference between Node.js and AngularJS?
Between Node.js and AngularJS?
Yes.
Clarification, is the question that is the difference between Node.js and AngularJS or something else?
That's the question that Shiba has typed in, that she would like to understand what is the difference between Node.js and Angular.js.
Okay. So Node.js is, AngularJS is a client-side technology. By that, it runs in the browser and it's basically on the client's machine. Node.js, on the other hand, is a server-side technology. So you would replace your Java server, your Python, Ruby on Rails server with a Node.js server. What Node allows you to do is write your server side in complete JavaScript. And that's one of the reasons why this new concept of a mean stack, MongoDB, Express, AngularJS, Node.js has really taken off, because now you're writing your entire client plus server side in JavaScript. So to quickly summarize, Node.js is the server, AngularJS is the client-side technology.
Thank you so much, Shyam. I have a very interesting question here from Vishal. Although I don't know if that can be, if this technology can help with that. Vishal wants to know that he has a lot of data that keeps changing frequently. For example, stock market data. Can you please tell how can he go about, using it or handling it with ng repeat or custom directive?
Okay. So great question, and it's a good theoretical exercise to run through for me as well. So what you're looking at is you want to display a whole bunch of, say, stock information. Now, whether you do it, let's think about the steps. So I have a bunch of stocks that I need to display. The first question for me from a UX side would be, how many stocks does the user need to see at any given point in time. As a user, I would probably not want to see more than 10, 20, at most 25. 25 DOM elements with, say, prices, that's pretty easy to handle with Angular. Now you can follow a sort of a carousel approach or a lazy loading or infinite scroll approach where once you load the first 25, 50, 30 stocks, display the data. As the user starts scrolling, you load more. Then it comes down to what information do you want to show for each stock. If it's simply the price and the change, that's not very hard. That's well within the scope of what Angular can handle, up to 100, 200 items. Now if you want to display a stock graph for each one, then again you have to think, how is the graph implemented? Whether you need to display it for each one or wait until the user sees it. The things I would start thinking about is the initial load. How much data do I want to initially show? How much of that data does the user see? Maybe I load 20, I show the user 10. And then as the user asks for it, I show the next 10. Then something we used for another directive was some sort of a carousel widget where instead of using 100 items, 100 DOM elements for 100 rows, we used 10 and then recycled the DOM elements as the user navigated. So that's another technique that's especially useful in mobile where you want to keep the DOM as light as possible. So think about data loading over the wire, think about DOM elements and the initial UX, and think about extra loading. How do you load that? Try with the ng repeat initially. The custom directive is an overkill I would not recommend until you don't have another option. Look at the presentation, the track by, the bind once are again techniques you can use to speed up things until you have no other choice. I hope that gives you some thought process on how to start approaching this.
Okay, thank you so much, Shyam. Since we are running short in time here, we are going to take last few questions. So our next question is by Amila, and she wants to know if she can use AngularJS with ASP.NET MVC.
Great question, and I'll give a very short answer. The answer is yes. ASP.NET MVC integrates very well with AngularJS, and I've seen quite a few client implementations which do that. So should be easily possible.
Another quick question by Divya. She wants to know if we can call a web service using AngularJS.
So AngularJS has a service called $HTTP, which allows you to make any kind of XHR, XML HTTP request. So any web service which is publicly accessible, you can make a GET or a POST request to it. So short answer again, yes, you can.
Another question by Shakti. How will you compare Meteor.js with AngularJS?
So again, it's more of an apples to oranges comparison because they both do two different things. So Meteor is around the concept of data and data synchronization across multiple clients. So it's not just a client-side technology, it's a client plus server technology. Whereas Angular is purely client-side. Meteor allows you to create these data model objects and have them be synced across different clients and display UIs using handlebars. Angular integrates with any kind of server, Meteor doesn't. Angular has its own template binding library and it's again purely client-side. So it's not a strict comparison and a lot of restrictions on Meteor as well. So not a fair comparison between the two.
Okay, that's a fair answer. Shakti, if you have a follow-up question, please type it in. Meanwhile, we'll take a follow-up question by Divya. She wants to know if we can integrate AngularJS with web objects.
Not sure what you mean by web objects. Slightly out of touch with ASP.NET.
Okay. Divya, can you please write a very descriptive question so we can take it up In meanwhile, we'll take another question by Bhaskar. He wants to know when to use factory versus provider versus services for $HTTP request, or what are the basic differences between these three services?
Great question, and a lot of that confusion really boils down to the really bad naming practices we had when we created Angular. So the difference between the .factory and the .service method in Angular is more around a preference for the developer. So .factory follows a JavaScript pattern of returning an object with the functions and APIs of the service. With a .service, you're instead giving it a JavaScript class for which Angular will create an instance. The usage between the two will remain exactly the same. It's only how you create it that changes. The newer book that I just released, AngularJS Up and Running, has a detailed comparison between these as well. The provider you would use when you have application level configuration that you need to do before your application starts. So think about route configuration. Think about HTTP provider where you need to set the content type across all the requests. So if you need to create a service which you need to configure at the start of your application, you would use a provider. Otherwise, either a factory or a service, depending on your preference. There is no performance difference or usage difference between the two. It's only the implementation that changes.
Okay, thank you so much, Shyam. We are quickly going to take last two questions here. I would request those who still have questions after the webinar to please mail them at webinars@srijan.in. Also, if you have any feedback or suggestions for us, feel free to write us a mail at the same address, webinars@srijan.in. Our next question is by Peter. He wants to know what other JS tools or frameworks do you usually use alongside AngularJS. He personally works with _JS and jQuery.
Great. So in terms of companions, so I keep switching between underscore and Lodash for my toolkit library. jQuery, I try to keep it as optional until I have no other choice but to use it, because Angular comes with jQuery Lite, which gives us most of the things from jQuery. Bootstrap CSS I use. On the JavaScript side, we have a few libraries that I use state provider, UI router over NGRoute. We have a few inbuilt libraries that we created for models and pop-ups and all that. My toolkit consists of AngularJS Batarang as a Chrome extension for debuggability and performance, and WebStorm for actual IDE and for Karma integration and all the other great stuff that WebStorm gives. The other thing is we usually integrate with Socket, so Socket.io or its equivalent. And integration is with Node, which again usually gives us a lot more flexibility in sharing of code between our server and our client. I think that's mostly it.
Okay. Interestingly, questions are still flooding in. So what we'll do is we'll try and take as many questions as possible in the next few minutes. So our next question is by Siraj. He wants to know, how do you achieve internationalization in AngularJS?
That's a topic I can go on and on about, but I'll try to briefly summarize my opinion on internationalization. So I believe internationalization is better off done as much as possible as a build step before your server is deployed, rather than doing it on the fly on the client for static strings. So these would be strings in the UI which would be same for all the users. So instead of doing an extra watch or bind on the client, I prefer to do that as part of a build step before the server is created. Generate HTML for each language and so on. I prefer Angular-Translate for localization and internationalization on the client side. And that I try to keep it specific to dynamic strings, things like fourth page of 15, or the date format or currency format. Localization rather than static strings. So I'm trying again to optimize the performance by not wasting my CPU cycles on unnecessary translations by having those constant things moved to the server.
Okay.
Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I hope so too. If you have a follow-up question, please type it in quickly. Another question by Divya. She wants to know if we can compare AngularJS with jQuery.
So the way I would look at it is jQuery is more of a toolkit in that it gives you a common way to work across browsers and interact with the DOM. And the way I would think about AngularJS is a layer on top of that. Now, can you do the same thing with jQuery as with Angular? Yes, but that's not really the aim. The aim is to reduce the amount of boilerplate code that you would end up writing with jQuery. Things like data binding, so manually finding a UI element, putting the value in it, or getting things out of it. Things like routing, handling different templates. These are things that Angular gives you out of the box. The other advantages of using Angular over pure jQuery is that it gives you a sort of structure and paradigm which jQuery does not. If you look at 3 or 4 different jQuery projects, each of them might follow a completely different approach to the UI. Whereas Angular, with the best practices, you have a sort of standards. So really Angular sits on top of jQuery to give you that MVC paradigm which jQuery by itself does not have.
Alright, thank you so much, Sham. Divya, I hope that answers your question. We'll take one last question here from Fahad. He wants to know what should be the key criteria when you're selecting an AngularJS framework for any application.
Was the question whether you're selecting the MVC framework or AngularJS framework?
AngularJS. He wants to know.
AngularJS, I mean, you already selected.
No, he wants to know what should be the criteria, for selecting a proper framework, and as in what under what circumstances should AngularJS be used for an application.
Right. Okay. Right. So when to use Angular, which is a good question. So it used to be about 3 years, 4 years ago, where I would highly recommend AngularJS for simple CRUD-based applications where you're just displaying data, updating data, and so on. But over the last few years, we've seen it used across multiple types and clients and verticals, where if you're displaying data and letting the user interact with it in any sort of manner, AngularJS makes sense. Where I would not use it are things like where it's a very canvas heavy, or something where I'm actually rendering and changing based on graphics. I would probably not use it. But content-based applications, I would heavily recommend AngularJS.
Okay, thank you so much. Since we are still receiving questions, I will request those guys to please be very patient, and if you have more questions after the webinar, you can drop us a mail at webinars@srijan.in. And for the questions that we have not taken in the webinar, we will get them answered for you through a mail by Sham, right? Okay, so once again, thank you so much, Sham. I'm sure everybody found your presentation very interesting and insightful. We received a lot of feedback from the participants today, and thank you so much for answering all the questions very patiently.
Thank you so much to all of you who attended, and thanks, Priyanka.
Yeah. A big thank you. Definitely. And a big thank you to all the attendees for joining us in today's webinar. I hope you found it very, very interesting and beneficial. I would also like to announce that our next webinar is an Entrepreneur's Guide to Open Data on 15th of October by Prasanna Lal Das, who is the lead program officer at the World Bank. We'll be sending you the registration link along with more details in a subsequent mail. So stay tuned and have a great day, guys.